Hi, everybody. I'm Scott,
And I'm Luke.
And I'm Jonathan.
and this is the No Way to Hollywood podcast. Woohoo!
Yep, that's what this is.
Bringing it down to the third. I don't know. I tried to do something that was a trilogy under there, and I really biffed it, which is exactly what we're going to talk about.
Biffing it?
No.
Oh.
We are talking about trilogies tonight. We have talked extensively through a list that we found somewhere online about the top movie trilogies.
And so we are clearly prepared.
Clearly prepared. That's what I'm trying to tell you right now, is that this show is going to be awesome. So just let it be, okay?
I've watched movies before. I've done it.
Oh my, what did I get myself into? I wonder sometimes. On that note, let's go ahead and let's start with talking about some movie trilogies. Why do we have movie trilogies? Which ones do we like? Let's kind of give our viewers a start on our background. Luke, you want to start us off?
I mean, I've seen some trilogies before. Okay, what are trilogies good for? Right, like they allow you to tell a longer story in a film context, right? Like ideally, you are doing something where you are telling a story, but then you're building on that, and then you're building on it even more, right? So you've got this complete tale that you're telling, which is why, for example, the latest Star Wars stuff is so bad because they didn't have that. They actually didn't have a plan or a reason to do what they're doing. And so it all falls apart because it's not really a trilogy. It's just 3 movies with the same characters, and it's a mess. So I think ideally you're dealing with a big story that you can break up into smaller segments and tell it that way. So it's kind of like the mini series of movies limited to 3.
That makes a lot of sense. Jonathan, how about you? What's your thoughts on trilogies in general?
I think Luke did a good job of this, saying what I think is sort of the basic concept that makes you get into it. Yeah, it's this promise of this is going to be a larger story. This is going to be a full, like they're going to have your arc in each movie for the characters, and you're going to have your big thing in each movie, but you're going to have this bigger thing that you're going to really feel and have depth in by the time you're in that third story. I guess as he was talking about that, I'm trying to think, trilogies just there's lots of things that go with trilogies, but I'm just thinking about how with the era of streaming and everything, this idea of long form storytelling with movie production budgets, because I think it's the other thing is trilogies were a place where you could get long form storytelling in visual media with a production budget that was high enough to have really cool spectacle, special effects, big actors, really good craft the whole way. Now, TV's not bad, but back in the day, right, when and I think of trilogies starting with Star Wars, really is what I think of trilogies starting with. It could be something else, but I'm not aware of it. I'm pretty sure Star Wars is the big blockbuster trilogy that starts all the blockbuster trilogies. And in that time frame, you had sort of long form storytelling, but nothing close to what we have now. TV shows are very episodic, right? Come in, here's your characters, here's the thing of the week, it's over. Come in, here's the thing of the week, it's over, right? And Star Wars and trilogies come in and say, here's the same character, and here's potentially even a single storyline plot through it, just like Luke was saying. And here's all the production to go with it. But now with Netflix and streaming shows being bingeable, you've got entire stories that are seasons long potentially, that are like, you've got episodes that are chapters of a book, that kind of thing. Like you've got 11, 12, 50 something chapters of a story that you're watching and going through. And so that's the other thing. I'm sorry, I'm just immediately going to what's happened to the trilogies. It's still around, and still the movie version. But even in the movies, you've got Marvel now with 20 something movies to do their trilogy of Avenger movies, which is actually there's the trilogy has really exploded. So if we're looking at it from a long form storytelling opportunity and a visual medium with, I think initially the opportunity of a really big production budget, we've now blown that out of the water too, because we've got such crazy production value in everything from TV on streaming to now it's no longer good enough to have a trilogy. Now you've got the Marvel Cinematic Universe with 20-something movies to understand what the crap is going on.
So
You know,
this is raising a question for me. Like, why did it start with 3? Like, Scott, any guesses?
Well, I think a lot of storytelling is you have, your rise, you have this middle section, and then you've got the payoff at the end, right?
3-act structure.
Yep. It's the 3-act structure side of it, absolutely. So, in your first, you're setting up the characters, you're introducing, you're kind of giving them a little bit of a story. In the second, you present the challenge, you present, okay, what's the challenge going to be for these characters? What do they have to overcome? And the third act is usually the payoff of, yay, we win. And I mean, you see that in a lot of movies. I think, Star Wars is an interesting look at the original trilogy, anyways, is an interesting look at that structure because, your first story kind of, you still have 3 acts within the same movie. And it's only the first part of it's only the introduction to the overall trilogy. But by the time you get to the third one, you do have the payoff, which is why, even though we know it's episodes 4, 5, and 6, the other, prequels and the, most recent new Star Wars trilogy, as Luke already has pointed out, definitely fail because they're trying to go outside of that arc to a certain extent.
So this is making me think of an example, and this is the Before series, Before Sunset, Before Sunrise, Before Midnight, whatever the order is on those. And yeah, the idea of you're setting it up, what's the actual problem, how are you going to resolve it? And in this trilogy, it's like, here are 2 people who meet and they really like each other, right? We're setting up the world. The second film is, what happens if they didn't actually get together and then one of them got married to somebody else? What are you going to do about that? And then the third one is, now that they're together but having marital issues, what are you going to do about it, right? So it's like this, I wouldn't say that quite brings to like good conclusion, but I don't think that's the kind of films that they're trying to make there. But that's an interesting way of looking at the 3, right? Like, set it up, create the real problem, and then how do you bring it all home, right?
Right.
Yeah, but it's interesting about that is I don't think that like a really good trilogy, like a good 3-act story is setting up your real problem in the first act, right?
Sure.
And that's that in a good script, for instance, right? You have to set up what the real problem is pretty early on, like first 10 pages almost. You got to have what your real problem is at least hinted at or, shown. And the trilogy, especially thinking about Star Wars, where George Lucas makes a movie, puts all this stuff in it, wants to do this thing, he wants to make it like a serial. He does. And then there's a time, there's time for a sequel. That sort of sets up the archetype of, in my mind, the first movie is often just welcome to the world, welcome to the characters. We hope you like it, and here's a victory. Right? Like, that's often your first movie. Doesn't mean it's always your first movie, especially as movie making trilogies get more advanced, but it's often that. And then the reason it becomes why is the second one the real problem? Because then it's we've got so much love for this. We can easily get 2 more movies out of this, right? So we know we'll get 2 more. So let's actually make a bigger story that we know can have a cliffhanger ending and move forward on that. Does Star Wars end with a cliffhanger ending? No. Does Empire Strikes Back end with a cliffhanger ending? Yes, it does. And you can go on and on. This is why The Lord of the Rings, right, being based on books, which was originally J.R.R. Tolkien trying to make 1 book and was being told by the publisher, make it 3, right? This splitting up 1 story, The Fellowship of the Ring had an actual cliffhanger ending, right? The very first movie had an actual cliffhanger ending. And I remember people coming back from the theater and being like, wait, that didn't resolve. And it's like, yeah, because this is actually a 3-part story. This is designed to be a 3-part story. So I love Lord of the Rings. I kind of think of Lord of the Rings as the proper, what Star Wars was for other people in the 70s, 80s, right? And for that generation, as a trilogy, filmmaking, all that kind of stuff culturally. I kind of look at Lord of the Rings as being my Star Wars for my generation because of what it did and how it was awesome. And it sort of was on the opposite, not the opposite end of the spectrum, but where Star Wars came and said, here's a satisfying whole story. Okay, now we get 2 more, so we'll bring things back and we'll make it more intense and make a real problem and all that. Lord of the Rings just says, there's a ring, it's got to go to Mordor, Sauron's the problem. Let's go, right? And from there, that's the whole movie. Like that's the whole story. Every time you got to deal with that every single time. There's always the ring. There's always going to be Mount Doom. There's always going to be Sauron in some capacity and his forces. There's new things brought up. There's new things happening, but it's all that story. And that's partly adaptation, like I said. But I don't know. I guess as we're talking about trilogies, there's definitely been different ways of doing it. And if we, The Godfather, right? The Godfather is The Godfather Part 1, which is called The Godfather because it wasn't called Part 1, right? It's Godfather Part 2, and then Godfather Part 3. Godfather is a very much wholly contained story.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need anything else. You're done when that movie's over, right?
Right. And Godfather Part 2 goes on and tells you the before and the after, which is an interesting dynamic. And then I've been told, even by my professors in college of film school, not to watch Part 3. So...
And Godfather was so complete for me, I never got around to watching the other ones.
I'd be curious what you think about Part 2 then, Luke. I mean, I don't know how much you liked or disliked Godfather Part 1, if you will, but Godfather Part 2 is considered to be like one of the most perfect sequels ever made. That's as good, if not better, than the first movie. One of the few that does that.
Do you feel like it did that?
I'm not a huge fan of the Godfather stories, but
okay,
I'm not a huge fan of the Godfather stories. I I can feel like lots of film nerds like hating me right now, but I'd be willing to watch the 2 of them again back to back, maybe, and going through it. But I think that what Scott brings up about the idea of like how it's a prequel and a sequel all at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a thing about legacy and who he's becoming. And that's probably what makes it so strong, I would say, because even I, having watched it maybe once a long time ago, can see that power and all of that. So that's part of what makes it as strong as it is, I think.
So speaking of perfect then, right? Like, what about Terminator, right? With Terminator 2, where you're ratcheting everything up, you're doing a great job of taking your original and then just like pushing it, right? But then I don't want to lose sight of like the terrible, right? Where we go from Lord of the Rings to Hobbit, where they're like, make it 3 just cause, not because we actually have a story here for you, or a budget or time or anything. But like, can we talk about like what makes it great versus terrible?
Well, yeah, I mean, if we're going to talk Hobbit though, Luke, we've got to first of all understand that the book, The Hobbit, was probably thinner than any of the individual books from Lord of the Rings.
Definitely.
And they tried to make it a 3-part movie.
Yeah.
I mean, there was not much to go on there. And somehow they decided, hey, let's stretch this out as much as possible.
Supposedly there's notes and stuff they were going off of, and yeah.
But they to that end, it's like they didn't even have the 3 acts in there. Like the first one at the end of the movie, I was just like, okay, that's great.
And if you want to learn more about this, watch Lindsay Ellis's stuff on this. I'll try to put the link below.
Cool. We don't need to go on The Hobbit for a while. There's a special case scenario with The Hobbit. A large part of that being that Peter Jackson got thrust into the director role way late and was trying to make something happen that he didn't have a vision for in a lot of ways.
But a bad trilogy to me also brings up a couple of other trilogies I've been thinking about, which, although there are 3 movies, I don't necessarily know that there is a traditional trilogy arc. And so the 2 examples that I'm going to bring up are Indiana Jones and Back to the Future. I feel like both of especially Indiana Jones, is basically 3 individual stories with at least the one central character. And beyond that, does it matter what order they're in? No, it really doesn't. You could almost watch those 3 movies in any order you wanted, and they would have the same effect.
So
I
they're
would
episodic.
I would actually argue. Well, there's two things that come to mind. One, I would say that the Indiana Jones trilogy is far more like a serial
Mhm.
than the Star Wars trilogy because of what you just said, sort of the episodic nature of it. But I would also say that I don't necessarily think you can watch them in any order. And the reason I say that is because I think The Last Crusade is such a good final note on that character and on everything about that character that even though, yes, you could technically do it on its own first if you wanted to, I think it makes a lot more sense to watch either of the other two, in whatever you want to for those other two movies, and then watch Last Crusade last, because it really is there's a sense of finality in the filmmaking, in the story, and in the characters' portrayals or the actors' portrayals of those characters. Granted, we get 4, right? We got 4, and we're getting probably a 5
No,
or
we
6,
didn't.
I think.
We didn't get 4. I didn't watch it. Didn't happen.
It's not real.
Oh, well, anyway, all that to say.
Well, okay, and that just makes me think too of an earlier point about the third Indiana Jones gives you a kind of the prequel part and kind of the conclusion, right? Like you go back to him as kid, like you've got all this in there. So that's interesting that sometimes in these trilogies they go back in the end or in the middle or whatever.
Well, a classic. I mean, that's interesting observation, Luke. And a classic method for trying to make a trilogy end, a third story end or like a third act end is you kind of bookend things, right? You got to go back to one, you got to go back to the beginning, you got to go back, and everything's different now, or that's a very important part of a storytelling. In fact, I remember when I sort of recognized that it's not, the story isn't about the climax where you defeat the villain or whatever. The story is really satisfying when it's about going back to the land that was broken for some reason, or back to the person who was broken for some reason, and they're healed now, or they're different now, or like, you went on the journey to get the healing elixir for the land, and then you go through all this crazy stuff. And there's a villain, you got to fight him, but killing the villain or defeating him isn't the thing. The thing is going back home with the healing elixir and fixing everything. Like that's the big thing. And so this idea of back to one, and I know that we're going more than that, right? We're talking about what led you to this, right? Information we didn't yet know, revelation of how did Indiana Jones become Indiana Jones, or how did the Godfather, the first Godfather, Marlon Brando's character, how did he become the Godfather, right? Like it's these prequel elements. And that's the other thing. They're prequels, like the entire trilogies and movies are being made now about how things happened, and you could have done like so. In the same theory, if Return of the Jedi, instead of doing Ewoks or instead of doing a longer desert sequence with Jabba and all that, if they had instead been like, okay, so here's how Darth Vader became Darth Vader in 20 minutes or less, would that not have been more interesting than what we got? And I'm starting to wonder now, is there something about, with that observation, is there something about helping you not only get more information that you sort of maybe knew about or had or didn't even have an inkling about, didn't necessarily care about, but something that says this is exactly who this character is, with maybe a little bit more revelation about who they are, to help make you feel like you've gone farther by the end of the same movie, right? You've watched the other two movies, whatever, but like when you start with that other thing, you feel like you've gone farther by the end.
You've just done the one thing to Star Wars that I hate the most about what they're doing to Star Wars right now, though, Jonathan. And you hear me say this all the time, and you just did it.
Well, okay,
but you wouldn't have cared because it would have happened in Return of the Jedi, and you would have grown up with it and accepted that rule as a possibility. So screw it. Shove it right up in Star Wars.
Hang on. Time out here, because it's interesting, because even with Back to the Future, we have this too, by going back to his dad and kind of where's all that going from, but then also going back and seeing, or going forward and seeing his kids, and like just seeing these loops that are happening to help you develop out where these characters come from and where they're going.
It's the essence of the character, right? It's like it's about saying this is who this person is through and through, or this is this person's legacy through and through, or like in Back to the Future, the whole thing is about being chicken, right? Like ultimately the big arc for Marty McFly is like, stop being goaded into the whole chicken crap. Like just give that up, right? But he doesn't see it until finally it's like, your family for generations has dealt with stuff like this, and you need to learn how to rise above it, just like the other great members of your family have, right? Like there's this whole thing there. And so it's this Yeah, it's interesting. You go back to help the character or help the audience at least know that this has been the character forever. This is the essence of their thing, the essence of their struggle. Indiana Jones. Yeah, you see where snakes come from and all that kind of fun stuff. But there's two things you learn. He always had the sense to want to put stuff in a museum. He always wanted to be that guy. He always had this practical, like you see these things that were already there his entire life. And then you see why. You see his dad. You see his relationship with his dad. And suddenly everything about that character now comes back to his relationship with his father. And that's the thing that's going to be resolved by the end of the film, right? And so and it's partly, I would argue, not it's actually really good writing, but it's also partly because they're not setting up the real stuff in the first movie, right? This is the same thing of in the first movie, here's a fun character, here's a fun world, and we set up some cool things, but like we're not going anywhere per se. We just made a good movie with resolution. But now we have to do something. So when you get to your third movie, you're like, right, so now we're gonna go back and kind of tell you like what the big thing is. And now we're gonna resolve it.
And then thinking about Back to the Future, I mean, I get that the second one is dark and hard to deal with, right? Because it's like, wow, this world is terrible, which is the whole point of it. But
Right.
I actually really like how they loop things back through. And like, there's really good things where it feels really clever and really well, established for stuff. But that's kind of how I feel about the first one too. So maybe I'm just mixing everything up. But like, I really like how at least, I mean, I think I prefer the first and the second Back to the Future more than the third, because the third one just kind of feels like it's out over here for me. Whereas these two fit within this like experience of these two characters, right? Like, and how they work together with Biff and Marty and just all that. So yeah.
I don't know where they could have gone with the third one, because like the first two looped back over each other so much.
Right.
That I don't know that there was space left for the third one to do that. They had to be like, okay, let's take a step back and let's go somewhere else. And
right. And it's not that I don't dislike the third one. It's just, it doesn't have that same fit, right? It's this over here thing.
Right.
Well, okay. That aside, and I like the third Back to the Future, by the way. And again, yeah, it's sort of, again, it's the resolving one. And this is, again, the same basic archetype of a lot of trilogies that are some of the big ones, which is first movie is just a movie. It's just a movie that's fun and cool. And maybe, like Back to the Future, they had a fun idea of like, well, let's just make it kind of fun. Like, Doc comes back and says like, oh, there's stuff about your kids that have to be accomplished. As far as I understand, that was not like, well, we have all this idea figured out. It was just a, it's sort of that TV show thing or cliffhanger thing, or just like they wanted to play a joke almost, where it's like, and now you see where it came from. You get a little bit of resolution on what that would mean and where they would maybe go, and it's an idea. But they fell through on it. And so in 2 and 3, it's all about setting things up and paying them off and trying to make that whole thing come together and resolve. And there's so many movies in trilogies that, yeah, the first one's great and enjoyable, but it's not really trying to set up much more than what it is. And then it tries to do that in the second story. And then it has to resolve it in the third story. All while somehow paying homage to and or carrying on notes from the first story. And sometimes they do it really well, and sometimes they don't. Like the Matrix trilogy. You may love it, hate it, you may be whatever on it, right? The vast majority of us tend to say there's one Matrix movie, really, and it's The Matrix. We don't need anything else. But that's the same sort of the Here's this great story. And the Wachowskis actually had ideas in mind of what they wanted to do if they got more than one movie. And they even tried to set some of that up, or they even had some conversations about how certain lines couldn't be said because they didn't want to hint at ideas that would be cluttered later on and if they got more movies. But even with that forethought, it still definitely feels like here's one movie, it's really good. Here's two other movies that are trying to set up conflicts and resolve them that you don't like believe should be there in a sense. I mean, in that case, it's truly, I don't believe they should even exist in this world or whatever. It's not the thing I wanted.
And it's not that there's in that world. It's not that there's not good moments in 2 and 3, but at the same time, the Matrix trilogy is so weird, and it doesn't. I feel like we've had the full arc within the first one, and then the second two are, hey, let's just play with this idea a little bit more. And I mean, yeah, there's some resolution at the end of the third, but it's kind of like it doesn't pay off as well as the resolution that you already had from the first movie.
But let's talk about something. I want to shift the conversation just a little bit. I want to go back to Terminator because there's far more than just 3 movies, but there are 3 Terminator movies, lest anyone should forget. There's Terminator, which starts everything off and is a complete story that suggests what's going to happen in the future and it ends. There's Terminator 2, which is really, really good for, like, especially at the time. It was fantastic and upping the ante in every possible way, changing things just enough to make it very interesting and to be a different story. And then even that one has a sort of very climactic end. And that's the thing. There's these movies where it's like you did enough when you did 1. You did enough when you did 2, right? Like, I don't even need more than 2. Aliens, another James Cameron sequel where here's everything. I'm going to up the ante, change the genre, change the story a little bit about this, make it interesting in this way. And now I make it very climactic and awesome, right? And then a third movie comes in because somebody is hired, told, whatever, to continue the franchise for money reasons, fundamentally. And it's just nowhere near as good. It's not a story anymore that's worth really paying attention to in a lot of those cases. And Back to the Future and Indiana Jones and Star Wars are a lot more of, I think, of here's a really good first movie and we want a sequel and we can probably get 2 and, we'll do what we want. Indiana Jones, I don't think they're thinking about 3. I think they just made a second one and then they're like, oh, let's make another one and be done with this. And there's sort of this, I don't know, there's just sort of this progression. It's so many of these stories, these movie trilogies are not about a storyline. They're not about a single storyline. They were never conceived that way, right? They are about awesome characters and worlds that we wanted to go back to and how do we do it well, which is why some of the best sequels, right, are truly just the next one, and that's all you need, right? Because it was a cool thing. That's all I thought. Well, I thought about it again. I thought, there's some more things I could do. So I did it again. I did the new things. I'm done now, right? I'm out.
But I want to go back to our original concept of like the 3-act play because, I mean, if I think about it, the trilogies that I tend to gravitate towards as the ones that I would consider my favorites are still the ones that have a 3-act. Like, I love Back to the Future, but it's not the best trilogy for me. I like Indiana Jones a lot, but it's not the best trilogy for me.
Sure,
and if I'm going to what are the best trilogies, like the original Star Wars, it has the 3 acts. The Lord of the Rings has the 3 acts, although they kind of mix mash where the first, second, and third act go, but that's another story. But to me, I guess I'm wondering why would I be more attracted to that kind of having those 3 acts?
Yeah, and this is interesting because we've also delved into worlds where they do just keep making movies because it's not actually about being a trilogy. It's about being multiple movies in the world. So like Blade, right? Like you got a Blade 2, you got Blade 3 over here. Like you just make these movies and you just keep making them in the world, but are they really a trilogy? And then if we think of like Die Hard, right? Like there's a lot of Die Hards, like all the way to Vengeancing and whatever. Like, so it's not about a story. It's about here's a character and let's keep doing it. And so I could see why, Scott, you're saying I want the actual trilogy where it is a story that is set for this. And then other worlds that have fun characters and we can just revisit 20 times. Thanks you, Marvel. Like, okay, but like it's not this.
I'm almost about to say something I never thought I would ever say, which is I'm not sure that trilogies have any place in movies in a weird way. And I don't really mean that. Like I love me some trilogies. I mean, all the ones we're talking about is I love sequels to some movies. I love some of these things. I love a good trilogy. I love a good ending to a trilogy. I love that stuff. But like Star Wars, I honestly believe, as best I understand it, you've got 2 narratives I think you believe with Star Wars, the original trilogy, which is either one, you really do believe that George had all this story in his head or written down or something, and he could only make one part of it, and then he went and made the other parts of it. I don't buy that. I'm very much of the opinion that he may have had some ideas about like what maybe some of the stuff was here or there, or where it was going here and there, but he didn't know. And I think that really basically a cool world, really cool special effects and stuff, but really some good, smart writers and directors came alongside George and helped him get through Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi and helped it feel like a complete story as opposed to serials or one-off adventures. And I think that's almost a miracle in a sense. Lord of the Rings is obviously adapting books. We already talked about that. So it's adapting a 3-series book that was already planned to be one story by J.R.R. Tolkien, and they just had to be faithful enough to maintain that. And those are great. Those are great trilogies. But Back to the Future, I totally agree. Is that really a fantastic trilogy? I don't think so. I think there's really fun, cool stuff in all the different movies in different ways. But really, Back to the Future, you really only need the first Back to the Future. That's a fantastic movie. You don't really need anything else.
Right.
And Indiana Jones, I love 1 and I love 3, I think, even more. But you know, there's a reason why 2 is kind of a doofus one. Like, it really is episodic, right? It's just like this is this and this. And I totally see what you're saying, where you want that complete story. But my first statement in this dialogue at this point, I'm thinking that, especially with where we currently are with potentially like an anthology TV series. And what I mean by that is a single season of a TV show that is a complete story, and then it's done. And you can have as much as 6 to 12 to 15, however many episodes, basically, and however long, hours, episodes, to tell a complete story that has a beginning, middle, end, that has that sort of depth that we long for, I think, from a trilogy in the movies. But the movies have been such a high stakes game of trying to make money that story has long been a second fiddle note when it comes to a trilogy or to sequels, because it's money that's been driving whether or not you get a sequel or not story that lets you complete something. And so a good movie can happen because it can be about the story and just trying to make the movie be good. And you get the chance to make one movie and you tell your story. But when you get into the trilogy world, you don't get many opportunities to know that you're going to have 2, let alone 3 movies, and that you're actually going to be bankrolled and that anyone's actually going to go see it. And then you do get bankrolled and you do have that opportunity and you're Star Wars and you don't have a plan because you don't know how to do this, because apparently you don't know how to make a story that's that long, because you never thought that way before, because even though you know you should be able to do that, you don't get that opportunity in movie making. That's a different storytelling medium.
Yeah.
And so you can only think one movie ahead. That's how you've been wired as a business.
And that's interesting because this started as a discussion about trilogies, but we've morphed over to sequels and these massive multi-part movies and like world exploration. And okay, I think this is really interesting. I don't know where else I'm going to go tonight with this, but that's cool. This opened up a big door. I like it.
Okay, so help me understand why I'm still drawn to the trilogies that have a legit, or feel like they have, whether it was intended that way or not, a legit beginning, middle, and end in 3 movies.
I have a couple thoughts. I don't know if it matters. I mean, I don't know how much it matters to you, Scott, that it is a trilogy in that format. What I'm going to wager is that what you really want is you want a good story that is one story that is uniform and together, where it's about depth, right? Like longer stories are supposed to be able to allow you to have a greater depth in concepts, in characters, and even in plot, right? You're supposed to have a chance to really dig into what that is. And so I would wager that what you are really longing for is a deeper story, and a story that also, very importantly, has an end, and has an end that was being built towards the entire time. That is one of the most important things, right? If you don't stick your if you don't have a good enough beginning, no one will watch, right? But if you don't stick your landing, no one will ever watch again, right? Like that's the thing. And so when you have gone through the process of investing your time as an audience member, and you got intrigued enough to watch, and you liked it the first time, but you knew it wasn't over, and so you decided to invest continuously until it was over, and the time it took to invest was maybe 3 movies, maybe years of your life waiting for that story to be done, right? Waiting for that movie to come out so you can watch the last one. And then you watch the last one, and it actually built to something. It actually built to a conclusion that was satisfying and resolving and meant something to at least the characters and to the world that which you were in. That is a greatly satisfying, very good thing. That's great storytelling. We all long for that, whether it's a book or a movie or TV show. It's just that trilogies have always been well, I think that I always wanted, and I always felt like trilogies were promising to me what we're talking about, Scott, what you're longing for, what I think you're longing for, what I long for in a trilogy. It's just that as we go and now analyze trilogies, I'm just a little more cynical, but there's so many trilogies that were never designed that way. Were never built that way. We're never having that really in mind. And it was, either you were a really good writer who could somehow pull something together out of what you had and make it feel that way. And maybe you were rare enough to have Lord of the Rings or something you were adapting or whatever that was a fully satisfying story. You just did a really good job of keeping to it enough to make it work. But yeah, I mean, of course we long for deep storytelling, and we long for really good satisfactory resolution, even if it's bad, even if it's tragedy, just as long as it makes sense and sort of resolves rightly and feels right for the characters and the story. It may not be fun, but at least it makes sense, and you feel like everything was sort of earned. That depth is what we really long for, and trilogies at least say they will do that.
Yeah,
and sometimes they do.
Well, and I like your explanation of depth in this matter, right? And in a single movie, you can have plants and payoffs that are good and work, but in a trilogy, you end up having more plants and more payoffs that go a little bit deeper. And we've had the argument before amongst ourselves and with friends of which Lord of the Rings movie do we all like best? And it's such a common answer to say, well, the last one, that's the best because you have all these great battles and things get resolved. And well, that's because everyone likes the completion. Like everyone likes, it's not just drawing a half circle, it's drawing the full circle. And when you can complete that circle, there's a sense of completeness that just feels right.
And I would like to say, I'm thinking about Avengers Endgame, and that's the great culmination of the 22 movies of the Marvel universe, right? And the thing about Endgame to me is two things that really worked for it were, one, it had characters that we knew, right? We knew these characters through and through because we've seen them a bunch of times. So like a TV show or any other long form story, at that point, your characters and you like them. And if you like them a lot, you like them a lot. So no matter what they do, you're kind of with them, right? As long as they stay consistent or right. And you've been maybe waiting for some resolutions for a long time. And really, Endgame just has a ton of payoffs to little and big plants throughout 22 movies. And that is one of the strongest ways to feel satisfying for an end, is to have planted something earlier and to let that pay off later. And Endgame is chock full of plants and payoffs. Not the least of which, even to the point where Captain America, spoilers if you haven't seen Endgame, which, you're under a rock at this point. But if, there's a hammer that Thor wields, that only Thor can wield. And Captain America wields it in the end of the movie, right? And it's great for a lot of reasons. It's exciting for a lot of reasons. But the biggest one to me that made me feel so great was that it had meaning. The hammer had meaning. It had an assigned value that was planted long ago about that hammer meant you were worthy of something, right? You had to be worthy to wield it. And there was a whole movie 20 movies ago where Captain America tried to pick up that hammer and he almost did. He almost picked it up, but he couldn't. But he almost did. It made you wonder if he would. And suddenly, not thinking about it, 20 movies later, that payoff comes, that payoff for that little plant comes off and it feels satisfying, right? That at the very least, just because of time, makes you feel like it's deep.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's why I don't think that I like the Dark Knight series so much, because it ends and I'm like, what are we doing here? This is dumb. So yeah.
What? I think that the Dark Knight Rises is kind of clunky, but I do think there's something interesting about what they do with the character by the end. But that's a whole other conversation. Well, maybe we'll do a Dark Knight Rises review or whatever we did. The what do we call that? Case study? Maybe we'll do a case study on the Dark Knight Rises.
Well, thanks for joining us for this interesting conversation about trilogies. Before we go, I'm going to ask all of us to give you a recommendation of a trilogy that we think you should go out and enjoy. Who wants to start us off tonight?
We have to do a trilogy.
Yeah. Sorry, shock value.
We even went through a list of trilogies.
Okay, you know what I'll do? I'll do something a little aside. I mean, obviously, Lord of the Rings. I mean, just do it. But like, here's the one I'm going to actually give you: Oceans 11, 12, and 13. And I'm going to make an argument right now, briefly, that Oceans 12 is actually pretty great. It is. I think it's actually pretty great. Now, I am not claiming that the Oceans trilogy is like these other trilogies, like the thing we're longing for in this sort of like one continuous story that's deep and has a lot of satisfactory stuff. It is not that. Oceans 11, 12, and 13 are a series of TV episodes of characters you like. You get to enjoy characters. And if you like those characters, you'll like that trilogy. And the 12th, Ocean's 12 is unique and different, and it's weird and it's complicated. But once you get familiar with it, I think that you would enjoy it more. And 13 and 11 are both a bunch of fun. You know, they're all fun. So Oceans 11, 12, and 13. It's not the deep trilogy. It's not a single story trilogy, but it's fun and it's got a satisfaction of sort of hanging out with fun thieves.
I guess I'll say go try Bourne again. I don't know. Something like that.
The Bourne trilogy?
Yeah.
The Jason Bourne trilogy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Without the Jason Bourne movie, just
right.
Bourne
Yeah.
Identity.
Trilogy.
You don't need that. The Bourne Identity, Supremacy, and then Ultimatum, if you were confused.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great trilogy. That was going to possibly be my recommendation, but I'm going to give you one other one, and that is going to be the Toy Story trilogy. In terms of an animated movie, I think these three, the first three, because the fourth one is give or take, and didn't need to be done. But they're just fun movies that bring you to a world that feels like it could be real, and that could be part of your world. I think the characters are great, and the different stages that they go throughout the story of Toy Story 1, 2, and 3 are just delightful and wonderful and fun, and you should go out and enjoy it. So there you are. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you again next time.
Yep, we will.
Uh-huh.